So we are on Tezayin Amud Beis 16b. Yeah, we have a copy there. It's on the table, I think. Tezayin Beis 16b.
So what are you saying?
Tezayin B, Beis 16b.
I thought you wanted the water.
No. Thank you. So we are in the middle of our discussion about the Sotah proceeding, obviously. We covered the offering, the mincha offering. We covered and then we began discussing the water that she will drink. This water, earth, is the mixture of ink that comes off of the parchment on which they write section of Torah, which we'll discuss in the next section of the Gemara. And when we get into the details of the Sotah water, we began with first of all the actual vessel. We talked about the water. We talked about the earth and that it could or could not be ashes. And now we discuss the order in which the earth and the water should be put into the cup. Like which one should we put first? Right, so we had a discussion earlier about, first of all, the visibility of the earth, that the earth has to cover the surface of the water. And that was compared to the ashes of the paraduma, the spit of the yavama, and Rabbi Shmuel added as well as the blood of a certain mitzvah offering that goes on top of water that has to cover the surface. And there was a dispute whether it has to be viewed or not, or just mixed. Right? So now we get to the order. Which one comes first, earth or water? That's about a quarter from the bottom of the page, I believe. Yeah, about a quarter from the bottom.
That's really the discussion, because didn't you say last week that the earth had to cover the water?
Yeah, well, if you have very little water,
Earth first and the water.
if you have very little water, and you put lots of earth and then you put water, it'll still be covered. Right?
You put like a mound of earth.
If you have a lot of earth, then you put a little bit of water. Right, the water is only, what is it, a revius? No, that was for the blood. There's very little water. The earth can still cover the surface of the water.
I was thinking,
Water.
Preconception of like a lot of water.
It's very little. The water always goes to the lowest part, right? Water always looks for the lowest point. So it'll always go lower. If you have enough earth. I suppose, but that's a good point to keep in mind. Yeah.
In my head.
Yeah. It's a good point. If the earth is going to be on top of the water, then it would have to be a lot, enough that whatever water you put in would seep to the bottom and the earth would stay above the surface. Yeah, correct. Okay, says the Gemara, about a quarter from the bottom of the page, the line begins with the word Shenitres mipnei hamayim. Then we have Taner Rabbanan, Tafresh. Taner Rabbanan, our sages taught in Mishnaic age text. Hiktim Afar lamayim. If the earth was put in the vessel before the water, puzzle, it's invalid. This is the halacha. The halacha follows your suggestion. The water got to go first, and the earth on top of it.
The earth was, yeah.
Right? Yeah. But if you reverse the order and put the earth in first and the water on afterward, invalid. This is the opinion of the majority of sages. There is, however, the minority opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon allows, Rabbi Shimon says, not that you should do so, but if you did, it'd be kosher. He doesn't say you should put the earth first. He just says, if you did, it's kosher. Okay.
So you're saying if you did the reverse, it's still kosher?
Yes. Not that you should, but that if you did, it's kosher.
After the fact.
It seems like that. That's the language. Language is not.
Doesn't say after the fact.
That's right. The language is not should you or should you not, but rather valid or invalid. So valid or invalid is the implication that the kind of phrasing is that we're talking about after the fact. So the sages say after the fact, it's still invalid. And Rabbi Shimon says after the fact, it's kosher. And then from the Gemara's discussion in a moment, it's going to emerge that this is seemingly the correct reading. Before we go forward, Rashi tells us that the simple reading why the sages are of the view that it is invalid if the earth went in first. Because the verse says, with respect to the earth, the nasan elamayim, and you shall put it to the water. The fact that it said to the water is what taught us before that it should cover the surface of the water, but that too also implies put it to the water as if the water is already there. Right? So because the verse says you should put the earth to the water, implying the water is already there, the question of the Gemara becomes, why would Rabbi Shimon validate it? Why would he allow it? So my time with Rabbi Shimon, what is the reason for Rabbi Shimon giving this allowance? So he says as follows, because the verse says, with respect to the law of the red heifer, right? So again, the red heifer is this red cow that is burnt on top of this large structure, slaughtered and burnt, and then eventually those ashes are mixed into water and then sprinkled on somebody who is ritually impure for having come in contact with a corpse. So there too, you have this mixture of water and not earth, but ashes. Now, the verse reads there with respect to the law of the red heifer, the lak hulatame, and they should take for the one who is impure, me efer sreifas achatas, from the earth of the burnt sacrifice, the burnt red heifer. Now, the verse here, if you listen carefully, I translated, says the earth of the burnt sacrifice rather than the ashes. We've noted before in a previous class that the word afar and afer, earth and ashes, have a very similar pronunciation. In fact, exactly the same. The difference is ayin or aleph. With an ayin, it's earth, and with an aleph, it's ashes. So here the Torah refers to ashes as afar, but with an ayin as opposed to an aleph, which would be earth. So what's the story here? Why is the verse refer afar with an ayin? Ayin fe resh or aleph fe resh. So the Torah refers to the ashes as earth with an ayin. Why? So we had this before as the site Shammai, the house of Shammai, used this as a proof that ashes and earth are interchangeable, right? That was the discussion there. But a similar kind of thing is being stated here.
And why is it with an ayin, I guess?
Yeah.
If you're using ashes or a heifer.
It should be with an aleph describing ashes as opposed to ayin, which is earth. So says the Gemara Tanya, we learn based on this verse, Rabbi Shimon says, the same Rabbi Shimon, who is the one that allows for the earth to be put in first. So he teaches, are we talking about earth here? Is it not ashes? Afer with an aleph. So why does the verse say, take from the earth of the burnt offering, of the burnt red heifer? So says the Gemara, says Rabbi Shimon, the Torah changed its language, its meaning, Gezeira Shaveh, to allow us to learn a Gezeira Shaveh, right? We've been asked to point out, change the language to help us.
To use a Gezeira Shaveh.
Gezeira Shaveh, yes. So we've been asked to point out when we hit some of the 13 principles. This is one of the 13 principles of interpretation, which is Gezeira Shaveh. But you know, Gezeira Shaveh is the second one in the list that we read every morning. And Gezeira Shaveh is essentially as follows: when you have, on the face of it, it's very logical, but it's not universally applied in its logic. Meaning like this: the principle is that when the Torah uses the same word in two different places, so if it's the same word and they have commonality in their meaning, obviously that's how we have language. Language is through consistent use of the same word to describe the same thing, right? That's how we have language. So the Torah uses the same word to describe two things, then it follows then that there's got to be some sort of similarity between these two items we're talking about. That's the baseline logic of this system. But it's not exactly limited to the logic here and not applied universally. Because, number one, Gezeira Shaveh sometimes goes beyond the actual meaning of the actual word. But because there's two words that have the same, the mitzvah about which that word is used will teach something to the mitzvah about which that word is used, even if they aren't related to the actual word. Something just because the Torah has associated words, therefore they teach each other laws, even if it isn't associated with the actual meaning of the word in question. Number one. But because of that, you can't apply that universally, because then you would have laws being taught to each other all over the Torah, because the words are used all the time similarly, right? And therefore, there are limitations to when you can make Gezeira Shaveh. And two basic ones, one we just mentioned, and one which is more important in some ways than the one we just mentioned.
I'm sorry, can you just re-explain that first way?
Right, so if we were just to say that
the meanings, you're saying the meanings?
okay, the underlying logic is that when you have two words that are the same, it's because they both mean the same thing. Otherwise, that's the whole point, right? Right. But that's not exactly how it works, because that would mean only that they teach each other things about that word in particular. That's not always the case. Sometimes Gezeira Shaveh teaches a detail to another mitzvah that's unrelated to the word in question.
Yeah. So
just a random detail about this mitzvah.
You're like expanding the meaning.
That's right. So it's not even the meaning.
To
so it becomes not even the meaning of the word anymore. It just becomes something about this mitzvah will teach you something about this mitzvah because they happen to share the same word.
Right. So it's easily challengeable, I guess, in some cases.
Wait, so 1 second. So if we were to just stop at this point, then you would have mitzvahs teaching each other details all over Torah. Because all over Torah, the same words are used.
Right.
So you would never have a cohesive mitzvah ever, because you constantly be learning details from other mitzvahs because they're constantly having the same words, right? So there are limitations to when you can make this Gezeira Shaveh. You can't just, like for example, a Kal V'chomer is almost always universal, or other logical deductions are almost always universal, like a Klal U'Prat Klal we had before, when the Torah states a generalistic term and then a particular term and then a generalistic term. It's universally applied, basically. Or Binyan Av is also universally applied, but this one is not. So here are two limitations. There are more, but here are two important limitations, one of which is alluded to here, and one of which is almost more important than the one alluded to here. Two limitations on when you can use Gezeira Shaveh. You can't just take, in other words like this, you can't just take two words, you can't just take the same word you find in two random mitzvahs and then teach each other details to those mitzvahs. You can't do that, because you'd have never-ending comparison between mitzvahs, because the same words appear in Torah all the time. Right? That's how language is. You constantly be using the same words in different contexts, right? So two limitations are as follows. Number one, I'll use the more important one that's not mentioned here, and then I'll tell you the one that's mentioned here. Sorry?
Good.
Yeah. So limitation number one is like this. A Gezeira Shaveh is only used when there is a tradition going back to Moshe Rabbeinu that these two words are a Gezeira Shaveh. Now, the tradition itself that goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu about a Gezeira Shaveh isn't necessarily always to all the details. It's not as if the tradition will be that these two words are Gezeira Shaveh, and here's the particular law you're going to learn from the Gezeira Shaveh. That's not always the case. Sometimes the tradition is that these two mitzvahs have a Gezeira Shaveh. Go figure out which word and go figure out which law. So you have to apply a bunch of other rules to determine which word of these two mitzvahs is the Gezeira Shaveh. And then once you know which word, which detail is being taught to each other through the Gezeira Shaveh. Because all you have by tradition is that there is a Gezeira Shaveh here. That could be one scenario. Or it could be you'll have a tradition that says this word and this word are associated. Now go figure out which detail of them is being taught to each other.
So it's either you may have to find the details and
the word.
The word.
Sometimes that's right. Or sometimes the reverse. These two mitzvahs share detail. Now go figure out how the Gezeira Shaveh is made. Right? So, but there has to be some sort of tradition that goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu related to the Gezeira Shaveh you're doing. And sometimes you'll find in the Gemara where a certain sage will say, look, I never heard from my teacher that there is such a Gezeira Shaveh here, so I cannot come to terms with the way you're learning Gezeira Shaveh. Whereas the other sage will say, look, I learned from my teacher who learned from his teacher that there is a Gezeira Shaveh here. Right? And that sometimes will cause a dispute between sages, where one sage has a tradition from his teacher that there's a Gezeira Shaveh, and the other sage does not have that tradition. For whatever reason, that tradition never made it to him, that there is a Gezeira Shaveh there.
How do you know that it goes back all the way to Moses?
Like all the oral tradition. The entirety of the oral tradition is only written down first in the Mishnah. There's almost 1,000 years from the Mishnah to the Moshe Rabbeinu, right? So they had each prophet, and then later the kings and so on, and the judges, they each had huge court, which extended to a whole yeshiva. The Sanhedrin was a whole yeshiva, not just the court of 72 people. But there was a whole yeshiva of people in waiting that when the seat opens up in the Sanhedrin, somebody else will take a spot. So the Sanhedrin was a few hundred people, actually. It's a whole school like a mini university, at the top of which this was the Sanhedrin. And this university, this like massive yeshiva, was responsible for preserving the tradition. Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students, right? It's a huge number of students.
Presumably, no, on the Sanhedrin.
Sorry?
You went on to the Sanhedrin.
Of those, yeah, some of them would, and some of them wouldn't, right? Actually, the Rambam describes a whole system of miniature Sanhedrins in cities, which each had their own miniature yeshivas, and then the best and brightest of those would go to the one in Jerusalem, and the best and brightest of those would make it to the one temple, and the best and brightest of those would make it to the Sanhedrin. So you always had this like whole system of new students coming up, working their way up to the top, and obviously not everybody made it to the top. Most people did not. Only 72 made it to the top. And even in the 72, there's a hierarchy.
Right, weren't students on one side?
That's right. That's correct. A whole system. That's right. So this whole system of yeshiva was responsible for preserving tradition.
So they had oral tradition. Okay,
that's correct.
From this, then.
That's right. And they wrote down notes, but not. They all wrote down notes, but not officially published. And these notes were collected in the Mishnah. Right. Okay. So that's number one. Rule number one is, in order for Gezeira Shaveh to work, in order for there to be Gezeira Shaveh at all, there has to be a tradition. The details of the tradition vary from Gezeira Shaveh to Gezeira Shaveh. Whether we know there's a word association, but we're not sure what the detail is. Whether we know the detail, we're not sure which word it is. Or whether we know that there is a Gezeira Shaveh here between these two mitzvahs, but we don't know which word it is. Or maybe there's a tradition that says this mitzvah has a Gezeira Shaveh, and I go figure out which one the Torah is from. Who knows? There could be something, but as long as you have a tradition. That's rule number one. Rule number two is, and this is what we're finding here, a Gezeira Shaveh can only be done in such a way where that word is free to be used for Gezeira Shaveh. If that word is essential to the content itself being relayed, then it isn't free for Gezeira Shaveh. And that's what we have here. The content itself actually should have said ashes, but instead it says earth. So it's freeing itself up for Gezeira Shaveh. And that's rule number two. There are other rules for Gezeira Shaveh, but these are the two big ones. And one of them being right here.
I'm sorry, can you, I have here, when the word is free to be used, that's all I have. That's
correct. Which means there has to be some sort of change in the phrasing of the verse that indicates to you this word is here to be used for Gezeira Shaveh. Meaning the Torah should have written it a different way, or wrote it this way so that you should do Gezeira Shaveh. Here's a classic example. The Torah should have written.
This would have said ashes.
It would have said ashes with an aleph. Okay. So it changed the phrasing to tell you this word you can use for something else.
Okay. So now it's been freed from its original meaning.
That's correct. It's been freed from its original meaning to allow you to use Gezeira Shaveh. That's correct. So this is important rule number two for Gezeira Shaveh, and that's what we have over here.
So here would be ashes to earth.
That's correct. It sometimes gets tricky because sometimes the Gemara uses the word Gezeira Shaveh not in its literal meaning of like a traditional Gezeira Shaveh that I just described, and sometimes the Gemara just means like associated word in the classic logical sense that you have two words that are associated and therefore they must have some sort of related common theme. And sometimes it's kind of tricky to know which one's which. But over here it seems like it's an actual Gezeira Shaveh. That's what it seems like over here. Okay, so what's the Gezeira Shaveh? So again, Shina Kosa B'Mashmoi, the Torah changed its language from ashes to earth, from Efer to Afar, Lodon Heimena Gezeira Shaveh, to allow you to learn or to offer it to you so that you can use Gezeira Shaveh and you can derive al halacha from somewhere else, namely from the law of the Sotah, which also has earth being mixed into water. Whereas the Paraduma has ashes mixed into water, and yet the Torah refers to those ashes as earth being mixed into the water for you to compare it to elsewhere where earth is mixed into water. So name like this. Nemar kan afar, it says here by the Sotah water. Afar, earth, and Nemar lahalon, and it says over there with respect to the law of the Red Heifer, afar earth.
With an iron, right?
With an ayin, even though it should have said with an aleph. So ma lahalon, just like when it comes over there. When it comes over there by the Red Heifer. Afar al gabe mayim, the earth, sorry, just like over there, when it comes to the Sotah water, I'm sorry. it says the earth should go on top of the water, at least in the first instance, because the verse says the nasan el hamayim, we should put the earth to the water. So the first instance describe, at least the first case scenario, not the post factum, but the first case scenario is you should put the earth on top of the water. So afkan, so to here, with respect to the paradum, with respect to the red heifer, afar al gabamayim, we should put the earth / ashes on top of the water. Okay, so far, actually, this doesn't support Rabbi Shimon's view. It supports the sages would say you should put the earth on top of the water. But Gezeira Shaveh works two ways. Gezeira Shaveh doesn't just teach you one law, a detail from this mitzvah to that mitzvah, but it also tells you a detail from that mitzvah to this mitzvah.
So in other words, it's bidirectional?
It's bidirectional. So therefore, now what we've done is, we've taken a detail from the Sotah, which is that the verse says in the first instance, you should put the earth on top of the water. And we've transferred that to the paraduma, to the red heifer, that in the first instance, you should put the ashes on top of the water. But now it's going to go the other direction. Makan, just like here with respect to the red heifer, hiktim afalamayim, if post factum, you put earth first, or you put ashes first, and then you put water, kosher, it's still valid, even though you shouldn't have done so. But it's still valid. That's the law with respect to the red heifer. So aflahalan, so too there with respect to the Sotah, hiktim afalamayim. If you put the earth into the water first, you put the earth first and then the water, kosher, it's valid. So that was like this. The Sotah states, put the earth on top of the water, which means that's the best way to do it. So that teaches you by the red heifer, same thing is true also. Ashes on top of water. Water first. That's the best way to do it.
You're learning what to do with the red heifer from the Sotah.
That's right. But that's right. That in the first case scenario, water goes in first, and then earth. But when it comes to the red heifer, we know that if you did it the reverse way, it's still valid. And that teaches you a law by the Sotah that if you did it by the reverse way, it's also valid. Even though the verse says to put the earth in first, because put the water in first. Because in the verse says to put the water in first, it's telling you in the first instance. But if post factum you put the earth in first, it's still valid. And we know that from the red heifer, because the red heifer, you can do both ways.
Can you just explain again, sorry, how we learned from the red heifer that it's okay post factum?
So let's see. And over there with respect to the red heifer, how do we know that it can go both ways? Right? How do you know that when it comes to the red heifer, you can do either water first or earth first?
Yeah.
We didn't get to that yet. So it says, how do you know that? So today, kroi ksifi, because when it comes to the red heifer, there are two verses. Ksiv, it says alav. It says you should put the water on top of it. Alma, this implies afar berdesha, that the ashes should. Apologies, got disconnected for a second. Okay, so where were we?
Wanted to
okay, yeah.
why the red heifer.
So the red heifer can go both ways. Yeah. So because today kroi ksivi, there are two verses that are stated with respect to the red heifer. Ksiv, it says with the red heifer alav. It says you should put the water on top of it. Alma, this implies afer berdesha. Put the ashes first because you put the water on top of it. The ksiv, but it also says mayim chayim el keli. It says living waters to the vessel. So when it says to put it says at one time it says put the water onto the ashes, implying ashes first. But another verse says, with respect to the red heifer, that living water should go to the vessel. Alma implying mayim bereisha, the water should be first, because it says water to the vessel, without the interruption of ashes in between. So one verse says put the water on top of the ashes.
That's the one, sorry, that's the one that says you put water on top of it. That's
one says on top of it, one second, one says on top of it, meaning on top of ashes. And the other verse says living waters to the vessel. That is to say the water should go directly to the vessel without ashes there, implying water first.
Okay.
So how do you reconcile these two verses? Therefore, Ratza Zen Noisin. If you want, you could do this one first. Ratza Zen Noisin. If you want, you can do that one first. No problem. You can do both. Okay, so when it comes to the red heifer, we see clearly you can do one or the other. When it comes to the Sotah, the verse definitely says that you should put the water first. Right? And these two laws are teaching something to each other. So one mitzvah, the red heifer says, do whichever one you want first, earth or water. One mitzvah, Sotah, says, do water first. And now these two mitzvahs are supposed to teach each other. What do they teach each other?
Right.
Well, they teach each other, then the first case scenario, water first, like Sotah. But if you didn't, it's still kosher, like Red Heifer. That's how they teach each other.
Right, so it seems like the Red Heifer is allowing expansion to both mitzvahs.
It's allowing expansion.
Limitation of
Yes.
the Sotah onto the.
Oh, wait a second, but there is a limitation that the Sotah implies.
onto
So
the
that
Red Heifer?
there is, seemingly. This is my understanding. I could be wrong, but it's my understanding. Because I thought about that, and I think this is the right way. Because if you're correct, then the paraduma, then the Red Heifer is giving expansion to the Sotah, but the Sotah is not teaching anything to the Red Heifer. And the Mishnah Gemara seems to imply that it goes both directions. Right? So what's the Sotah teaching the Red Heifer? So I think what the Sotah is teaching the Red Heifer is the limitation of, in the first case scenario, best to do water.
Okay.
Right? So the paraduma is expanding. No, if it was paraduma alone, if it was paraduma alone, it would be zero preference. Whichever one you want first. If it was Sotah alone, it would be limitation, must be water first. The combination of the two is that yes, it's kosher if you did both, as per paraduma, but preference, water first, as per Sotah. I think that's the way it's supposed to be done here. I could see someone learning it differently, but I think this is the right way to learn, because the Gemara implies a two-way correlation.
That would be Shimon.
And that's Rabbi Shimon, which is why Rabbi Shimon uses the language, not mutter, you're allowed to put the water first, or you're allowed to put the earth first. He says machshir. He okays it if you put earth first. But in the first case scenario, you should put the water first. That's right. And that's the limitation the Sotah is giving us. That's correct. That's the Sotah's contribution to this Gezeira Shaveh.
You said it, Gezeira Shaveh not necessarily has to go both ways.
I'm quite sure that Gezeira Shaveh universally goes both ways. I'm quite sure. Yeah, I could be wrong about this, but I'm quite sure Gezeira Shaveh universally goes both ways.
That's a good way to test it too, right? To see if it's really,
I suppose, yeah.
Just did.
Yeah.
See,
goes both ways, yeah.
If it doesn't, then it could be a problem.
It's going to be bilateral,
Yeah.
I think, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so that question becomes the sages. But Rabbanan, where do the sages stand on this discussion? The sages are of the view that the water always has to go first. Okay, so if they are of the view that the water always goes first, so obviously they disregard this Gezeira Shaveh for whatever reason. Maybe they just don't have it by tradition, or whatever reason they decide to discard this Gezeira Shaveh, or maybe for them the word afar is not freed because they use it to tell us that ashes and earth are related. I don't know.
So they say water always first, but that means if it's not, then it's invalid.
That's correct. If it's not, it's invalid. Even by the Red Heifer. Right?
Yeah, but how could they say that with the Red Heifer when there were two verses that said
good question.
living waters are none of
So says the Gemara.
I mean, the first one.
That's right. So what do the verses do? What do the sages do with the verse that say that the living waters have to go directly to the vessel? El Kelly, directly to the vessel.
Yeah, the verse that says.
So says the Gemara that dafka, the verse which says El Kelly, put the water to the vessel, that means specifically put the water to the vessel. Okay, but there's another verse which says Alav, put the water on top of it, on top of the ashes.
Yeah,
which implies you can do the other way too. Says the Gemara, the sages say la'arvan. When the verse says put the water on top of the ashes, it doesn't mean that you can have the ashes in there first and then put the water later. It means that once the ashes are put in, mix it in with each other. And that way they're all on top of each other. So when the verse says put the water on top of it, it's not talking about how you pour it. It's talking about once the ashes are in there that you should mix it. But when the verse says put the water to the vessel, that's specific. The water should go first.
That's from the Sotah.
No, from the Red Heifer itself. They seem to discard the whole Gezeira Shaveh to begin with.
Okay.
From the Red Heifer itself, they are of the view that when the verse says put the water to the vessel, it means literally put the water to the vessel, water first. And then when the verse says, put the water on top of it, doesn't mean on top of the ashes. It means mix it with the ashes. Yeah. Yes.
In other words, even though you put the
water first,
the water first, It means then you mix.
That's
you
correct.
The ashes and you mix them together.
That's correct.
Mixing.
So the Gemara asks, okay, so why are you choosing one verse to be literal and the other verse to be interpretive? Maybe do it the reverse. The Ema, maybe you should do the other way around. Allah dafka, when it says to put the water on top of the ashes, that should be literal. Maybe that's what that means. You chose, the Gemara is saying, you, the sages, chose to take the verse which says put the water onto the vessel. Take that one literally. It must go in first. And then when the verse says put the water on top of the ashes, oh, it's not literal, it means to mix.
You mix your rationale.
You're choosing which one you want to take literally and which one interpretively. So why not reverse them? Take the one that says put the water on top of the ashes, take that one literally, but the ashes have to go in first. And the other verse which says El Kelly, and the other verse which says put the water to the vessel, doesn't mean that the water should go in first, but rather should take the use and the Kelly. That you should take the water directly from the You should take the water directly with the vessel, as opposed to taking one vessel, filling it up from the well, and then pouring it into your vessel. Take the vessel itself and go. And that's what it means to the vessel. It doesn't mean that there should be empty, but rather that the vessel itself should go to pick up the water, as opposed to going through a third vessel. Maybe that's what it means. So why are you taking one literally and the other one interpretively? Take that one literally and interpret the other one. Following? Says the Gemara, no.
I think you're comparing the verses from the Sotah.
No. We're just talking about the Red Heifer laws.
There are 2 verses in the Red Heifer.
Correct.
You put water on top of it.
That's right.
It's implying the ashes are
First.
And then I have the second one is living waters to the vessel.
That's right. It's also talking about the Red Heifer. They're both talking about the Red Heifer.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So we chose to make that second verse, put the living water to the vessel, take that one literally. That water got to go first. And then when the verse says put the ashes on top, put the water on top of the ashes, it just means to mix. It doesn't mean literally put the water on top of the ashes, because interpret, right?
Meaning
Mixing. So it says the Gemara, reverse it. Take the other verse. Why are you taking one literally and the other one interpretively? The other way around. Following?
Yeah.
So the verse which says,
how you would understand the verse.
That's right. So the verse which says put the water on top of it, take that one literally. That water goes on top of ashes. As for the verse which says put the living water to the vessel, that just means take your actual vessel, which has ashes in it, and pick the water up with it, rather than taking a ladle or taking some other vessel and pouring it into your vessel.
Okay.
Following? Okay. In other words, so now the Gemara is stuck with the point where you have the option to do one interpretively and one literally, or the other one interpretively and the other one literally. Meaning, we still don't have a consensus on specifically putting the water first. Clear? Says the Gemara, final line.
Sorry,
yeah, no worries. Yeah. So says the Gemara. Ma matzina b'chol makom, just as we find everywhere with respect to the Sotah and with respect to the bird of the Mitzvah, where you have blood and water mixed together. Machshir lamaila, the validating item goes second. The water doesn't make it a valid sprinkling mechanism. That's just plain water. What makes it a valid sprinkling mechanism with respect to the Mitzvah is the blood. And the blood must go on top of the water. And that's the validating mechanism. It's the validating item. Same thing with the Sotah. What makes it a drinkable water for the Sotah? What makes it valid for drinking? Not the water. The water is universal. What makes it valid now is the earth. And the earth goes on top of the water. So Afkan, so too here with the sprinkling of the Red Heifer. The water itself is not what makes it a validated sprinkling mechanism. It's the ashes that does that. And therefore, Machshir Lamaila, the validating items got to go on top. And this is the universal principle that the sages derive. In other words, this is actually, it's actually another principle, which is, I don't know if this is exactly the case, but it's another one of the principles of it could be like a binyan av. A binyan av is literally means building a principle, building a father, building a principle, which is once you have a certain principle established, then that principle becomes applied universally. So we have a principle from the Sotah and from the blood of the bird, that the item which validates the water for usage goes last, goes on top. So the item which validates the water for usage by the sprinkling of the Gezeira goes on top, yes. That's literally the language of the Gemara, Lamaila. So by the Sotah, the validating item, which is the earth, goes on top of the water. By the sprinkling of the blood of the Gezeira, the validating item, which is the blood, goes on top of the water. And therefore, this creates a principle that by the ashes also, the validating item, which is the ashes, should go on top of the water. And therefore, the verse which says, put the water directly to the vegetable, that must be taken literally. So that way you have the ashes coming second. And the verse which says to put the water on top of the ashes, that just means to mix it. It doesn't mean literally to put the water on top of the ashes. Yeah, so,
okay, so we're doing what the sages suggest.
this is the dispute. This is the dispute between the sages and Rabbi Shimon.
Yeah.
We clear?
Yeah.
It's quite the mind bender, but we did it.
Okay, so essentially the sages are rejecting the Gezeira Shaveh.
Correct.
And they found this principle with the Sotah and the Mitzvah.
Yeah.
Say that you have to put the validating item second
to the water, after the water.
That could be used then for the Sotah.
That could be used for the Sotah is part of the principle for the Red Heifer as well. That's
right.
right.
You have to change the meaning
of the other verse.
Like instead of number one being interpreted, it would have to be
that's right.
literal, and then the other one.
That's correct. Correct. Yeah. So a little bit of Talmudic thinking.
Yeah.
A little mind exercise in the morning.
Yeah.
Connecting to Hashem's logic and Hashem's Torah. What?
That's my gym.
Yeah. Above and beyond all, this is the divine system of thinking.
Yeah.
We connect to that. We use our brain, we use our bandwidth to think.
To unravel
Torah mysteries rather than silliness.
That's
right. Okay, wonderful day.